Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm just going to move you guys to the separate screen and move it to my main and see if that fixes it.
Yeah, otherwise you probably have to like restart the web browser or something. It's a little drastic there.
End up getting out of your guys' hair and out of having to do a presentation. That sounds awesome.
No, that's not awesome at all.
Let's see. We are going to.
So, Nico, I'll be sure. So, you're going to introduce yourself. Nico joined us a few months ago. Well, it's been longer than that. As you were starting your career into the Ruby world, but you have a really interesting background. You didn't kind of come the traditional way. And so I'm personally really excited to hear what Nico has to share about this road less traveled. That's kind of how I'm interpreting this.
Yes. Good. I don't know if that's a pun or not.
No, I was being quite serious.
At the moment, because it is. Well, so a few things before I start. Yes, I came. I don't know how to explain. Like, I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. But I like to be really good at things. I think that it's like that idea of like 90 being in the top 90% is good enough. And really, when it comes to like customer expectation, code quality, etc., like if you're 95% there, what's the effort to get 5% more, 10% more? Like, is it worth it? So I've sound very masterful, but I'm not. So to qualify this discussion that I'm about to give you guys, it is all personal opinions, things that have come from my past, and the way that I apply that stuff towards my thinking in the future. So if that makes any sense. So if anybody has any questions about my history and what I've done, it's all very random. But like, as long as you can glean things from what you've done, I think you found success in learning it in life. Hence I lead with, there are no fine QA testers than the finer QA testers than the clients themselves. It just cracks me up because this talk is eventually about testing. And I feel like there are a certain amount of that MVP status that I just told you about, 90% there, that we drop the ball on the testing and are okay with allowing consumers, clients, guests, whatever, to have a bad experience at a certain point in time. And coming from, part of my experience is hospitality and the hospitality background, like, it is never okay in my mind to let somebody have a bad experience. And testing can help you fix that. So this was kind of a joke. So topic, biking, wine, testing, literally have nothing in common, or do they? I also did not know this. Sandy Metz is talking today, which I thought was super cool. So I'm competing with her. I also did not know that Sandy Metz uses biking as an analogy for object-oriented programming until today. So I found that out. So this topic has nothing to do with OOP and how Sandy Metz thinks. So my ramble to come. I'm going to talk about what I learned while biking, winemaking, life, how I can apply these thoughts to code testing, and a down and dirty walkthrough of kind of like of how to decrease context switching due to your test suite, and my philosophies that come along with that. Because we're legitimately, like, context switching is real, and any moment we can decrease that, the likelihood, that likelihood that we should take it. And the reason why, like, I chose this topic is it seems like, once again, like, there can not be the value needed placed on testing for why we do it, and doing it well, not just for the user, but doing it so that it doesn't impact, the developer. Because the easier you make testing, the easier you make it to test, the less that you have to context switch, the less friction that a developer has to not write that test in the first place, and just push it up because, it worked on local. It worked on my machine. So kind of one of the most important things to take from
Hey,
this is
Nico, Calvin
there's
asked a
a
good question.
framework of how much time.
Hey,
you're
Nico,
willing. What's up?
Calvin asked a good question. You mentioned
can't
that you were
see.
going to share something, but we're not seeing anything being shared. Do you think we're
Oh,
seeing something
man.
being shared?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Calvin,
Cool.
thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Let's do my entire screen. Let's do screen 1. Perfect. Can you guys see this?
I see a screen now, whereas before I just saw your wonderful face.
Perfect. Sorry. Can you see it now?
There are no finer QA testers.
Hey, the beginning. So obviously this is the beginning of my talk. There are no finer QA testers than the clients themselves. Antithetical, I think, to what this talk is going to be about. Title: biking, wine, testing. These things don't have. It can seem not to have anything in common, but ultimately, like, we can find commonalities and tie things together to learn from. So I'm going to talk about biking, winemaking, and life. How I'm going to how I apply these thoughts to coding and testing, and not just that, but like really how I approach what I do. The down and dirty walkthrough on how to decrease context switching due to your test suite. As I said, context switching is real, and it's something that if we can prevent it, we really should work on it. So those are the first 3 slides. And then, are we all here? It takes time to accomplish something beyond the simple. Hello?
Yep, you're good, man.
You're breaking up, but I can't hear you.
Okay, perfect. I can get a little closer. Essentially, like, it takes time to accomplish something beyond the simple. And what that comes from is that, like, you have to invest time into something, and how you invest time is up to you. And as a company, as a coder, as a development team, are you going to invest the time in something now, or are you going to invest the time in something later? Because every decision you make is going to account for that, account for something. Am I going to save it now, or am I going to do a shortcut or do something and I'll then pay it later, tech debt, right? Anybody can ride a bike. Basically, like, what I learned for biking is, like, repetition creates mastery. So for those of you that don't know, at the age of 18, I rode my bicycle across the country. I literally had never ridden my bicycle longer than 10 miles. I didn't train for this. My father asked me to do it with him, and I said, yeah. Being a cocky, self-assured 18-year-old, I was like, I can do anything. And I kind of haven't stopped thinking that way, but I have a different filter on how I come about it. But hubris is no bueno at all. So what ended up happening is, about a week and a half in or so, I think it's 10 days, we went over the hardest thing that I've ever done at that time. And it probably still is the hardest thing that I've ever done. You just kind of forget. I rode over this mountain pass called Going Over the Sun Highway. It's in Glacier National Park. That was brutal. Like, not training, not being ready for it, not understanding the kind of immensity that I was about to place in front of me was very difficult. And afterwards, we found out that I had overused my body. My knee couldn't support me anymore about a couple of days later. And so we just had to rest for a week because I had overused something that I hadn't used before. So, like, what I learned from that is, like, as I went on, I got better and better and better. I got more and more efficient. My body got better, better, better. And I didn't break after that, right? But it's because I did it every day. I got up, I did it, I rode, and I kept going. So that repetition taught my body its mastery to be able to do this motion or do this thing that's could be considered rote, but also is technical in nature, of understanding, like, how to downshift or upshift, go at the right pace, get behind somebody, draft, etc. Like, how to bike more efficiently came naturally just by doing it all the time. So the next one, kind of to Bailey's point, like you need to use the right tool. Why I learned this then was, I got a, I don't know, $1,000 bike, $1,500 bike, a very, what I thought was an expensive bike at the time. And I still got injured, right? I had this tool, but it wasn't the right one. Like it was out of the box, and it worked, but it ended up turning out that a part of the reason why I got injured was that my form was bad using this tool. And the only way to correct that form was actually that the bicycle was not adjusted to me. So it was a 1/4 inch shiv underneath 1 foot that ended up helping me out so that I could make the rest of the time go through. And the guy that did this was in a town of about 200,000 people or so, a small town, just had a bike repair shop, and he was able to help me. Which, when you need help, find an expert, right? Like I was new to biking, I didn't know, so we find an expert, and they're more than willing and more than likely to help you get better. So once again, with this find an expert, as a guy like I rode my bicycle across the country. Some people at that point would assume like I have some form of competency, some form of expertise, that I'm an amazing biker, and I am not. And I know that, right? I know that because of that guy who helped me fix my bike. I know that because I see people bike every day that are better than me. Like, so if I want to get better, I need to keep doing it every day. I need to perfect my tool, and I need to find an expert. How did this apply to code? As a boot camp graduate, literally repetition has been one of the ways that I've been able to want to be able to create mastery. It's not perfect; it never will be, but it's something that I'll strive for. And when in a weird way, I use Anki, a spaced repetition learning system, to get the syntax down. Because if by learning that by rote or memory, by repeating it over and over and over, I'm able to get it to cement in my long-term memory, which allows me to have conversations that are technical in nature and understand them when I am trying to code. So it's like applying this kind of repetition towards mastery in the right ways can help you move really far forward. And I think a lot of people are afraid of testing because they don't do that repetition through mastery. And there's a lot of people who, some companies who understand that and throw their juniors straight into testing. It's boring, but it's super important. So you're going to test all day long to understand the concepts of what are happening. So once again, the smallest change in your tool can be the most important. That shiv was the most important thing that was done to get me across the country. I don't know if I would have made it without it. So with your tool, can you tweak it? Can you use it in a very small way that will improve your happiness, improve cognitive, decrease cognitive dissonance when you're trying to work on things? Like, how can you make small changes in your tools that are going to help you be more effective? They don't have to be huge, right? And then fall into the I'm the expert trap. A part of this is like, we as people, we get battle scars, or we get norms that we form because that's how our brain has always thought. And when we get stuck in that trap, you start to think about things in a certain way. And if you haven't tested in a long time, or if you've always written tests the exact same way, take the time to analyze that and ask why. Like, what is different out there? Is there somebody who's trailblazing? Is there somebody who's doing something that is unique, that doesn't fit in your paradigm, but it might be worth it? It might be worth checking out what they're doing. And by the way, that's not me, because I'm not the expert. Like, that's finding the expert, or finding somebody who is an expert when you no longer are, and might think you are. Right. So, winemaking. How does winemaking have anything to do with code? Background for me, I worked at a winery for a little while, became like a apprentice winemaker. I was selling wine, listening to podcasts, and one day the owner was like, "Do you want to make wine?" So I started helping. After that, I brewed beer at another company for about 9 months. I got a brew for the Great American Beer Festival, which is super awesome. kind of one of my life goals. I like that kind of experience. So on the left, I'm like, it's kind of like this thing about wine, beer, and I've also been a bread maker. This is all true stuff. Knowing what to test and how to test it has a direct correlation to your hoodoo level. So how do we break the hoodoo of testing up into the science and the magic? So like where that comes from is I was actually comes from when I was baking bread. Like there's this idea when you do something that we have instinct, right, as a person. So you touch it, you feel it. Like bread, as it's coming together, will change in its texture, in its shape, and as well, like as crazy as it was when I was first starting to learn from this guy. Like you would touch it to feel if you'd gotten the ratios of water, salt, yeast, and flour together, like 4 ingredients, right? Super basic. Like you've got these 4 ingredients, and out of those 4 ingredients, the only way to tell it's done or it's ready in all of its different shapes and lifestyles, like everything that it proceeds through, is by touch and by sight, right? There's no scientific measurement here. I took umbrage to that. Like that's not true. Science is real, but so is magic in some ways, right? Like that is a magical thing to have to explain to somebody that when you touch it like this, can you feel that kind of tactile sensation? No, I can't, because I haven't done it 1,000 times. That's magic. Like I don't understand that yet, right? Magic. But the science of it is like gluten and gliadin are formed with water. It can be inhibited by salt. It can also be like as yeast can also be inhibited by salt. Like as yeast is growing, like the natural stretching of gluten and gliadin as they combine together is actually what forms up your structure, right? So now you know why the structure is happening. And that could be boring. You could just make bread, right? But if you know the what I'm trying to go to is like, if you know your tool, and the tool isn't just the thing that you're working with. It's not just stimulus reflex. It's not just RSpec, right? If you understand why, like how a WebSocket opens and closes and it's kind of ephemeral. If you understand, how your DOM is working, or if you're in a shadow DOM, for instance, like if you understand these things, those are your tools. Because as a bread baker, you have 4 ingredients, and one of them, one is water. You got to change that. You got to bring it up. You got to bring it down. You got to use it how you want to. But people think of it just as like the ingredient or the base technology. I didn't change that. What did I learn from biking? What did I learn from code? If you don't change that, like if you decide not to adjust those things, like you can just use your tool, right? If you know your tool really well, on the other side, like you can write amazing things. There are winemakers who will make an amazing product and not know why, right? Like the understanding of why is important in some respects, but I think there's like a paradigm shift maybe that like knowing your tool in the industry, as long as you know how to use Ruby on Rails, do you really need to know like the difference between HTTP2 and WebSockets? Who knows? So moving on. So basically the next one that I learned about, and after knowing your tool at the winery, I forget, I digress. When I was there, the winemaker was the one who taught me that know your tool aspect, and it's because he had just janky old equipment, but it worked, right? If you use it in a specific way, like it's a plus and a minus. Like you can still make a great product if you know your tool, even if it's not the most efficient. So reproducible excellence is the goal when you're making wine, when you're making bread, when you're making beer. What that means is you have to measure things. Measurement can be scary when it becomes to like coding in general, but when it comes to testing, like you need to measure how long things are taking, measure if things are taking longer, measure the overall, the slowest 100, the fastest 100. What are you doing right? With measurement, you can make decisions towards a better goal. So what works for small batches doesn't necessarily work for big batches. What that means is like in wine, in bread, in beer, like when you are making these things, you can make 5 gallons of beer, 5 liters of wine. But when you scale to 2,000 liters or 500 gallons, Like when you scale to this size, the knowing your tools becomes even more important, because you have to make changes to how you're doing things. What worked in the beginning isn't going to work when you get bigger, right? And to kind of bring that over to testing is I saw a statistic that like 90% of code bases that people are like responding to that they run tests on have 1,000 specs inside of them. But what happens when you have 10,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000? What works at 1,000, is it saves you time at that point, because you're allowing, FactoryBot to do what it's going to do for you and allowing it to set up all these associations. But if as you get that large, that amount of time that you spend, waiting for a test to run, even if it's in CI, is not a good thing. Like, I don't think that's a good thing at all. So understanding when that switch happens, when you're going to invest your time to switch over to potentially, doing things in a different way and spending time as a tester to do things more manually and not allow things to be, magically done for you, is one route that you could potentially take. So that was, I guess that was a little bit about like wine, beer, my experiences. And how I don't know, there's a lot to this, and how I think and what I want to apply, to this kind of topic. But for those of you,
interrupt you, but I wanted to say, just from my point of view, what you shared is really powerful. And the thing that set most strongly with me is the concept of reproducible excellence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really interesting that you chose to use those words.
Why?
Because so often I feel like we, as professionals, as developers, focus on more sort of like the fad of the day, versus like, no, the goal is to be able to consistently, reproducibly, and over time be excellent at our work, have our work be excellent in its execution.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'll let you carry on. I might feel the bourbon kind of nicely, and that those words sat with me, and I just thought, man, that is profound. And now, as I speak, I'm wondering if it's the bourbon talking. Thank you, Nico.
No,
carry on.
No. I guess I don't know. Like, I feel these things very strongly. Maybe that's why, hopefully, it will resonate with some people. It's because it's the same thing with customer experience that I talked about. Reproducible excellence I did choose that very specifically. I think so many people, as you said, want to use it's not a commentary towards like new and shiny, right? Because you can use new and shiny and still do it excellently, right? You can't unveil it till you've done it at that point. But by having your tests and by having proper documentation, the ability to communicate to the newer people on your team, the ability to teach other people, all come into this like reproducible excellence. So to circle back, like I did own my own business for a while. That was the bakery where I learned how to bake bread. Like I bought a bakery, but I didn't know how to bake bread. I learned how to do it after I bought the bakery. Wasn't the greatest decision of my life. So, but during that time, like you learn about teaching. You learn about like how do I provide the same customer experience, the same guest experience with a product, with somebody coming in to buy something, right? Like how do you do that every single day? And it comes with standards. It comes with measurement. It comes with understanding like how to do something, even if, like you said, it's not new and shiny. It's not exciting to bake bread. It really isn't. It's laborious, boring, but it very zen. But if you do it right, and you do the same thing over and over and over, like you provide a service to people. And one of the things is like, you got to quality test it. You have to taste your bread. You have to taste your food. You have to, before it even goes out, because something may have gone wrong. Like the amount of environment variables that could happen with just water, salt, yeast, and flour are astounding. So eat it. And if it's not good enough, don't put it out there. And that's what our test suite's for. Right? If you test in the right way and spend the kind of time to do that. And those aren't things that I know, right? I have the philosophy, but not the expertise to be able to teach you guys how to do that. So the quick and dirty, if for all you guys who are here who actually want to do something today, if you have, I think my spec suite, well, to tell you the truth, like I've never run my entire spec suite on local yet. That's terrifying to me because one, it's terrifyingly hard as a new person when you don't understand all the tools that you're supposed to use to have booted up, whether I have to have 3 different servers that are booted, a couple background scripts that are booted, and all these things that are working in conjunction to be able to let me run my test suite. And, I think Google had a very, I believe it was Google, it might be GitHub, my idols, that they have like a one script to rule them all policy where you come in and there's one script to rule them all. You don't have to use it. But this thing on your first day, when you run that, will allow you to access every part of the code base and run it. You don't have to know, right? Like, and that's the thing about knowing your tools. You don't have to know every single detail about what's happening behind the scenes, especially when your job is to write a great test. Right? Like if your attempt or your goal is to get somewhere. And I think DHH kind of has this philosophy that I agree with, that I heard at one of its talks was like reducing the amount of cognitive load into small slices. So like, I understand that this thing does something, but I don't need to know the entire mechanics of it, right? Like I know it does this. It's a reason. I think he was talking about originally like why like he wouldn't implement WebSockets. It's like until it was easy enough to just do easily, it wasn't worth doing, right? And that should be how testing is. Like it should be easy enough that everybody wants to do it. Anyways, so quick and dirty. What you absolutely should do first on your local if your test suite is out of control, install parallel spec. And in fact, over on the left there, Railscast, I think it's like 15 years old. It's very old. If you just do parallel spec and garbage collection in a single test file, there was 2,554 specs. Like I did do this on my local. I went from 4 minutes and 12 seconds to 49 seconds. If you add that up for 10, so say just 10 times a day, yourself or however many developers only have to aggregate to 10 times. You have 10 developers, they run it once, and they run it once a day for 52 weeks. That is 3.66 weeks of man hours that you save. And that is in a single unit test spec file. You get 3.66 weeks that you could save. One, hopefully that encourages your people to run their stuff locally and not in CI, because CI, you just have to wait for the entirety of it. So if you can at least run small amounts of testing faster, you're going to encourage one, writing the test, and two, the ability for people to not step away and get on YouTube, right? So those two things immediately are going to speed up everything you do, which then make the rest of like what's going to happen a little easier, because you can actually do it on local without having to wait for 30, 40, 50 minutes or longer for your entire spec suite to run. So what else you can do quickly with brute force? Comment out your entire spec helper. Gradually comment it back in. See what works. Like you're not testing anything. You're hopefully like allowing things to just break. And then on the left there, you'll see I threw in there test prof. They've got a RSpec stamp feature that you can run, and it'll stamp all of the failed tests for you. So you can filter out and be like, okay, I know all the ones that worked, and all the ones that failed. And the next time you run, you know all the extra ones that worked, and those ones can be filtered into a feature, or you can even like go smaller and scope them into meta tags, because there's certain very long running, feature tests potentially that they're the only ones that require that 5, 10, 15 that require a certain kind of spec helper setup. Do not put that on your entire feature test. You can flag it as just feature only, but none of the rest of them need that. So you're slowing all that down. So that would be the next one. Brute force, you're not testing, you're not trying anything really. You're just like commenting stuff. Same thing, you don't have to really understand what it's doing. Same thing with factory bot. Like I don't, people love it, right? Factories over fixtures. That's supposedly a thing. If you're going to if you're using create everywhere, stop, please. You were spending, like in the very beginning, this comes back to like when you do something in the very beginning, it's great. Yeah, just use create. I've only got 1,000 specs. Like my test suite is blazing, and I don't have to worry about like if this is hitting the database correctly, if I'm mocking or stubbing this correctly. Like I'm just creating this sucker, and I've set up my factory, to make it. That's great. But eventually, as you start to get that larger size, incremental changes in your tool will give you the kind of things that you need. Will give you the kind of freedom and the kind of time. If you save 3 minutes, you get 3.66 weeks. So if you save 1 minute, you're saving a week. Like and you keep breaking it down. Like I like to think of it like if you can save one step when you're walking on a regular thing that you do every day, how many miles do you save a year? Right? It's just one step. That's infinitesimally small compared to how much you walk all the time, but it adds up. Right? It's orders of magnitude. So to do this brute force thing, take all your creates, make them build stubs. Just global replace all. Run it. Hopefully with parallel stack, it's not going to take you longer than 20 minutes. If it does, maybe you have bigger problems to fry. So build stuff. If that doesn't, like, you're going to get failed. Go ahead, they're tagged. So take all the ones that failed and turn them into build. Did they work? Whichever ones work, keep them that way. The ones now that are tagged are the ones that failed. Those need create. Now you can create them. Right? And you can just use creates there. By doing that run 3, 1, 2, maybe 3 times, I think maybe you could do it 2 times, you are going to shave off so much time because you're going to stay out of the database layer. And that's the more that you get in there, like it's going to screw things up. And number 2, the more that you're in your database layer, if you aren't, flaky tests are real. Like, and those slow down your test suite. They take away your ability to believe that your tests are actually working. And if you see flakes and you're like, man, it's just a flaky test, and you let it fly, you're getting to the point in your life that, 1, it's too hard to find it, change it, make it better, because it just takes too much time. But you're also potentially allowing things to go into production that are broken, and you're starting a system of believing that broken things are okay. And if it's a broken experience for you, it's like the golden rule, right? Don't provide somebody a broken experience unless you want a broken experience back. And if you complain about not being able to do something, or if the experience was terrible, well, you're getting back, I guess, what you feed into the world. So those are the quick, like, brute force methods. If you want to spend more time and start to measure it. You got to get the first 100. If it's huge and it's super screwed up, like, get the first 100 slow tests. It can be really discouraging to try to work on something that's super huge. But if you get the first 100, like as factory bot, Thoughtbot says, like, you're able to break it down into smaller segments and start to work on it piecemeal to get better and better, and to start to get your future tests not to be terrible. They might not be great yet, but they're at least not going to be terrible. So you're not going to introduce any more slow tests or super slow tests at that point. One of those things, as they mentioned, is like they kind of did a proprietary thing using action messages. It's a system within Rails that sends out messages, and they use that to go ahead and tag how much they're hitting in the database. Personally, like I think that SpecProf and the stuff that Dimitri, I think his name is, Evil Martian, puts out with SpecProf and everything that goes along with it. It's an amazing tool. Using that to start to measure and get yourself into, you know, the place that you want to be, only benefits the team. Once again, you know, it kind of mentions in here, this theme about FactoryBot has been to move towards traits for explicit relationships. This is kind of like the problem why create is so crazy. And you can try to get rid of it by brute forcing it. It's the fact that like at LoadUp, we have a model, and on that model, there's 50 plus associations on it. If every single one of those is created and every single one of those associations has God knows how many associations, creating that model once with FactoryBot sets off a cascade of creation. We just spend it in the database, right? As that's working through. When all I really want to know is like, hey, does this order have a user with the first name? Like creating all the rest of that information. When I first made it, yeah, when I was the only developer, great. But now when test suites are so slow, as a company or as a team, do you want to spend more time having to explicitly set up the kind of information that you need, which you can do through traits? Or kind of sounds like you're moving over to making fixtures all over again, something that you have to like update, which is a hassle and takes time. But how much of that how much of that time, 10 minutes, whatever it is, in your day did you take to set it up correctly? And how much future time are you saving immediately, especially on a huge code base? So disable animations. We don't use any that I know of, so we didn't have to do that. Scrutinize the times that you sleep. This might be like news to people, but Capybara a little bit ago, maybe longer than I know of, went ahead and created its basically in-house wait features. So you can just wait for something to appear on the screen by trying to find it. And that will go ahead and wait for a predetermined amount of time, or just continue to wait for it. So it'll fire immediately and you don't waste any time by sleeping, like to just guess when is something going to appear. So kind of last, like I think people move over to CI once again because it's easy and it speeds up your test suite. But if you don't address like the bottom layer issues, the faults that you see, the cracks, like those things are only going to infiltrate your CI. And what happens one day when your CI is slow? Like how do you fix that? If your CI is slow, then your local is abysmally slow. So fix this other stuff first. Your CI is going to run like crazy, and you'll save a whole bunch of time.
My experience actually is that the local is far faster than the CI. CI runs on cloud rented resources that, depending on your budget, are quite constrained execution wise. You can throw really fast hardware at local and get good performance, especially if you're not running Mac. I know, a little dig there. The other thing, I'm living this now, Nico. Excuse me. I'm living this now, Nico. And one of the things specifically today was working on some scripting to let GitHub Actions feed a Ruby script that sits in front of RSpec a list of the files that changed in this pull request, so that it only runs the tests that changed in the pull request rather than
that'd be great. Yeah.
Than everything. And then you run everything at a different time. It's kind of like I went down the path of, I wonder if Guard can do this, because Guard does this all the time if you have it watching, but it turns out there's not probably could have made it work, but there's not a official way to invoke Guard giving it a list of files rather than asking it to listen for certain directory changes. But anyway.
Yeah. One of the things that I saw was like looking into that for CI optimization, part of a different talk, was using git diffs to kind of just determine already what files changed, to go ahead and just run the test suite based on that. And I think one of those issues becomes like, all right, how you're like lining up your namespace thing. Like if you don't have your full folder structure set up in a way that if you can do it with guard, that's amazing, right? Like so you can probably do it with just doing your git diff to judge what files changed, then use those file names to run the specific specs, right?
Yeah, I wrote a 44-line script that does all the translation today. It just needs to be fed the list of files changed from a git diff, and it should work. It's in full request review right now on a project where the Rails runtime is now something like 25 minutes per pull request just to run the regression test suite. So it's getting long enough where it's starting to become painful for folks.
Yeah. That's in CI, 25 minutes for the regression tests. Mm-hmm. Only the regression tests.
Yeah.
This topic reminded me of the importance of actually using the Unix design philosophy, because all of these problems would have been prevented if they just one program to one responsibility.
We're saying like one program to test and that's it?
I'm not sure I fully follow because tests take time.
Tests do take time, but one of the points he pointed out earlier was trying to, instead of having a test that does a million things, a test that does one thing, maybe optimized for that one thing.
Right.
That's basically the design philosophy.
But there's some things. So like one of the things I coach people who on my teams at is, there's this general thought of one test, one assertion. But if you actually have a variety of very related assertions, like to simplify, I do a thing that calculates a thing and shows a page, and now I want to make 5 assertions. It's 5 times more expensive to do that thing 5 times rather than to do it once and make my 5 assertions for different outputs to make sure that they're correct. So you don't want to get so pedantic about one test, one expectation.
I was referring to one responsibility. If
understood, it was just
that could be. You could make the assertion that there was multiple steps, and instead of those assertions could be part of the same responsibility if you're handling the same kind of data.
But what I've run into for certain is junior developers who read blog posts write their tests such that every single test has only one expect, and then we make it 10 times faster by saying, stop this. These are all related. It's all the same page. Rendering the same page 10 times doesn't bias anything in this case.
I would agree with that statement. I was working on one project for I was a freelance client. I was brought in to fix their code base. They kind of took that sentiment to a little too far, and it was literally assert this a million times instead of just going, okay, this is the landing page, 1 unit test to make sure the landing page is working correctly, 1 unit test to make sure the login page is working correctly, and it was a different database using MongoDB, and forget the whole thing, but you get what I'm saying. It's like instead of they had one common view component they were using on all their pages, and they're running the same test per page across the board. And I'm like,
I think this goes back to Nico's point of understanding your tool. Yeah. Not just at the surface level, but deeply understanding your tool. Being able to rattle off all those technical components of the bread. You should be able to do the equivalent for,
I agree
our test suite.
Absolutely.
I have a general philosophy of write as few tests as possible to make me feel confident in my code. And if I can get away with writing as few tests as possible, on a medium-sized application overall, that may only be 75% coverage or something, and it's a very quick executing test suite. And as bugs are introduced into the application, or if they are notified to us, then we can start writing tests that will address those specific cases. So over time, our test suite will grow and become more mature, as is our application becoming more mature. But we don't focus so much time on tests right off the bat, just because, you start to get into diminishing returns on this particular period of time that you're trying to roll out a new feature.
True.
I mean, my question is, how much of those tests like get outdated and are no longer needed because you're no longer. I mean, so there's.
Well,
It's
functionality is
possible,
often additive more than subtractive.
yeah, but there's. I mean, so there's Sandy Metz when she talks about testing. She's talking about. She mentions that the fastest code is the code you don't need and you don't write and you don't include in your application. And part of the testing methodology that she outlines is about when you don't need to write tests, and that's when an object sends a message to itself, or there's various times when you don't actually need to test something.
So my
like
rule of
output-
thumb, and I don't know if this is where you're going, Nelson, but my rule of thumb is I don't need to test the programming language. I need to test the unique business logic. I know can mean things in different contexts, but I'm testing business logic, not that Rails can do a validation or can call a function.
I mean, I think where I was going was like, how much of the time are you purging, finding all this outdated test code that doesn't really need to run because it's, it's testing outgoing query messages or outgoing commands instead of, things that matter.
Probably not enough to brutally honest answer your question. Like, I'm not sure I have followed that philosophy of removing tests, mainly because I look at it from the standpoint of what is tested in the first place. And also, for me, I care a lot about security regression. Like, I want to be certain that the software continues to function as it functioned before in the face of, we changed out this dependency because there was a CVE, or okay, we learned about this exploit, so I'm going to write code that actually tries to exploit it, as a negative test, and then fix the vulnerability. And now I want that vulnerability to be there, and it may be silly, like testing that this thing is raising an exception. It seems silly, so easy to remove, but it's also so easy for another developer to remove that security code that test is sticking around forever just to make sure it doesn't get removed. Probably a philosophical difference, but I super appreciate where you're going with that. And so, yeah, me personally, not enough. How about you?
I feel I don't remove old tests enough as well. But again, I do it for a similar reason. I'm often, for my personal hobby projects, playing around with new functionality. And then I think, no one's using this. And then I look up on wherever I'm distributing the app or whatever, and there's 1,000 users using this thing. So I better make sure I don't break whatever thing someone's using. But also, if I deprecate a functionality, that's when I remove a test. If I'm adding new functionality, I will keep the old test going up to the point I deprecate it. So I built a web app a while ago. I used to have some polling functionality on it. I got rid of it because no one used it, but I was adding a whole lot of functionality that shared a similar code base, a similar base class. So I was testing the polling just in case I made a brain fart and changed the base class that would break everything. Because oftentimes I would notice a bug in the fixture I'm working on now by seeing a bug in another program, which I didn't think to test, and go, oh, wait, yeah, these things are related. But
let's kind of go a little off topic from where we were. A question I had, and it's kind of something at least I haven't done, is the idea of like if we're going to like do a feature test, if we look at feature tests and we're like, well, if we're on the page, it's been rendered, let's just test everything that's there. So we're going to have however many expects on the page at that point. Assertions, right? So what about the opposite of like when you were setting up your tests? If you know that you're going to be hitting a certain and maybe this breaks away from the idea of random tests, but if you know that there's a certain set or subset, or you're able to identify like a subset of tests that have basically immutable data, like why not? At least seems like there's like a fear of setting up a before suite to set up all that stuff, specifically with that tag, because that like that setup is going to be necessary. It's going to be the same for all those tests, and yet at least I've come across the feelings that like we need to just do a raw setup every single time because it's bit us in the past, kind of thing. Is that something that y'all feel is kind of like the battle scars or wounds that have taught that kind of experience, or is that just personal preference? Was that understandable?
I hear you. I was going to let someone else say something. I was self-moderating.
You're fine. You're fine.
Did anyone have any follow-up to that? Nico's question? Maybe state it another way, Nico.
What is the opinion on setting up data that is persisted for multiple tests rather than raw new creation for every test?
I personally don't mind that. In fact, on some projects where I used fixtures rather than factories, I enjoyed the fact that the test data was like a plane, like a scene, a universe upon which my tests were acting, rather than something completely random every time. So the test fixture data becomes a stage for the test to act on, and that made it easier to talk about, reason about, and lots of other things.
I think it really just depends on the situation. I've had a application where in order to run a single test, it was very highly dependent on many other models and associations, up to 20 levels deep. It was kind of a nightmare to write any kind of test, but just because of the way this application worked, I could say it was a time and labor application. So you had a company had very strict rules on how employees could clock in, but they were also user defined. So at the end of the period, when you want to calculate the employee's pay, that employee's pay was dependent on any kind of calculation rules that they were assigned to. It was dependent on any kind of overtime rules or how their timesheet was set up and what the company policies were, any kind of holiday pay. So there were so many levels deep going in to just run a single test. So in those cases, we did notice that the database was often getting hammered when building these tests. So we could do a build statement like you had mentioned earlier in your talk, Nico, but that still had an issue with overhead because now we've took away the network and database layer from the transaction, and we're now just hammering the CPU with it, and as well as the memory. So that had some inverse side effects going that route. So what we did was we just created a pristine database file that essentially had all of the working data for a complete client setup, and that was exported as a SQL. And when we start off our test, we just inject the SQL into a fresh, clean test database, and the tests then ran extremely fast. On a smaller side project application, if I don't have a huge app and the tests run fast, and if it's something where I just have the CI/CD set to auto deploy if the tests are green, then I don't care how long the tests take, because I'm going to just continually push and it's going to continuously deploy. So I think it all depends on the context. How big is our team? How long do the tests actually take? And is it actually bothering us?
It seems like some people say like they're I've heard people don't want to like never seed your data, like try to seed your local database with FactoryBot. And it sounds like you're kind of doing the exact opposite with that SQL injection into your database.
No, it's not even just SQL injection. So, I mean, I have a project right now where the seeding time to set up the database to be able to run tests takes on the order of 5 or 6 minutes for generated data. I introduced recently a process to take that when it's seeded, do a SQL dump, and now a SQL.gz file is loaded instead. Only if you pass in the arguments -- rebuild seeds does it actually do the long process of rebuilding seeds. The reason for this again is I think it is easy for, okay, I'm going to pick on our Rails community, especially the testing culture, for briefly. I think it is easy for people with pristine apps to have a lot of privilege to talk about the one right way or how you could do it versus the reality of real enterprise business apps for an actual complicated domain space are heavily database dependent, meaning that the data really does drive the logic in such a way that it's really hard to isolate the CPU from the database, and it's better to know your database, much like it's better to know your bicycle, to know your tools, to use your metaphor earlier. Like, you get injured brute forcing trying to do it the run right way when maybe doing a PG dump and then sucking it in with PSQL as the first step is actually the better use of the tools. Because there comes a point where the business logic is inseparable from the data. In any practical way.
That should be the exception to the norm, though, right?
I think it probably should be, but I think
I think after a series of bad decisions, you just kind of had to take your best option at that point.
I think the problem with fixtures is that over time you quickly like feeding data, test data, is that over time you realize that is a huge impediment to continue this method and write more tests, right? And I think that's the reason why we have FactoryBot. It's just easier to just define new data than to to modify existing data, do a reseed, and hopefully you don't break other tests because you did something wrong to the seeds, right? So I think that's why factory method is the preferred method, because this is the ideal. Like, granted, in reality, there are going to be some exceptions, but I think they should be looked at as more exceptions and more than like this is acceptable practice.
But what do you do when FactoryBot is now taking 25 minutes to run?
Those are exceptions. That's why look at them as exceptions, because what happens is that you create these scenarios where like people say, "Oh, crap, I don't want to write the seed. I don't want to write a test because I have to set up all this stuff and then I have to do a seed and all this, and set up all these data records, and it becomes a pain in the butt." So that, what you want to do is create these test tools are supposed to make it easy to write tests, but I think we know like these seeds just they take maintenance, and you have to sort of curate them, right? Like And when your app is stable and you're adding less features, I think it makes sense to seed them. But there are definitely consequences. They take a toll when you're coming in and trying to develop new features.
And I think, and Dave mentioned one type of app, like a kind of an accounting system. I've dealt with a lot of enterprise, like I've dealt with a lot of like enterprise, like mortgage underwriting and insurance claim stuff. These are the type of industries where there's like official 1,000-line spreadsheets that define how the calculation has to be done. And that is the programming more so than any procedural code that you're going to write. And how you do those tests. And then they release a new spreadsheet every year. So the year that you do the calculation, data changes what data you have to seed in order to do the calculation. Like you just end up in this sort of regulatory enterprise software thing that I think is different. But to your point, Calvin,
I think that that kind of relates back to something that Dave said a while back about comfort level. And I kind of thought to myself something that a friend of mine said a while ago about how if you're a brain surgeon, you don't you have a lot less room for error compared to if you're, say, I don't know, a ditch digger. And I think there's kind of a analogy there that if you're working with mortgages and things like
the
that,
software's not allowed to be wrong.
Yeah. If the software is not allowed to be wrong, then there's a lot more testing that's probably going to be worthwhile. Yeah.
And, I might be the minority here in this thought process, but I actually prefer fixtures over factories. And the simple reason is because that's what's provided by Rails. And I don't have to add any extra dependencies into my application. And I actually get by pretty good with just using fixtures.
Yeah, I think that's what Rails itself uses. I remember DHH saying that that's what they use and always use is fixtures to test Rails itself.
There's a company out in California in the film industry doing smart contracts, all about fixtures. That I just talked with them a little bit, and they're everything. It's fixtures of factories for them. And I think that kind of leads to like the same, maybe like I thought it was a very interesting point, Frank, that you brought up, and Dave, you also kind of mentioned this interesting concept of like kind of going like halfway in between, where you are like you're creating factories, right? And then the first time you run it, like it's going to create everything, but then you're going to dump it, because if you're not making any changes at that point, like there's nothing wrong with seeding. If you're continually trying to create, but there wasn't a change. I don't have names on the screen at the moment. Someone mentioned like if you're more at a stable point in your life cycle, like then yeah, it makes sense to seed. But if you do make a single change, does it make sense to like continue? And these are decisions like the team about time. Like, does it make sense to continue to like only use factories because I may make a change one day, or does it make sense to use factories and dump the output into a seed, and then proceed from then on with the flag that you mentioned, or flag that you implemented, Frank, to just rebuild if you need to, because otherwise the data is consistent at that point, like as you get there. And I think that's like kind of leads back to where I'm like, it depends on what size you are. If you are small, as Dave mentioned, like you're running a specific kind of test suite, to continuously deploy, hopefully, like then you're just, it doesn't matter as much. But as you grow, what are the decisions that you have to make that will spend your developers' times, like with fixtures, to set up that amount of time, like 10 minutes? If it takes you 10 minutes to make sure that you set up the new fixture the way it's supposed to be because of your new feature, like how much time does that save overall? And I think we get into this idea that it takes too much time because it's immediate versus if my company's going to be around forever, like what am I willing to do?
Yeah, there's always going to be some kind of give and take. I think going with a gem file minimalist approach is going to be better for the long-term maintenance. And unless if a gem is providing such functionality that is going to save a lot of money or time, then I just stick with the provided default rails. And I've had cases where FactoryBot hasn't really been much of a culprit, but RSpec has been when upgrading my Rails application. When I was trying to upgrade to Rails 6 on one app, all of my tests broke, and I couldn't even do a bundle update because RSpec wouldn't update because it was too the version of Rails was too new. It was in beta, and I wanted to go ahead and run on the latest version. So, that's when I started to ditch RSpec and just use Minitest, because I know Minitest is going to work between versions. And I don't have to worry about that. So, I banged my head against the keyboard for several hours trying to figure out, okay, what do I need to do to get RSpec working on Rails 6 beta? And what do I need to do now?
Fork it and change the upper version number in the gem spec, and they just act like nothing happened.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things that we're going to spend the same amount of time somewhere, probably.
Yeah.
And it's just where do we want to spend it? I'd rather spend it, fixing some fixtures over banging my head against a keyboard trying to figure out why a third-party gem is preventing me from updating when it's not an integral part of the application that I'm developing on.
I don't think I'm quite as minimalist as Dave, but as a security professional, I can tell you the fewer gems you have, the fewer emergency CVE patching updates you're going to have to do.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the thing to consider is that though, like FactoryBot, and all the testing ones are not going to be deployed in production. So I mean,
yeah, that's true in this case.
Yeah.
So.
And I think Dave, I imagine though you would be managing fixtures more often than you would be updating FactoryBot, right, and running into issues with FactoryBot. I mean, I think those are things to consider. Like, how often would you run into those problems, the frequency, right?
Every time
I don't know.
the bot.
To me, I've never looked back from FactoryBot after seeing my fixture files that has user that is admin, user that is visitor, user that's admin that has the bad email, user that like. How do you manage that kind of data where you have all these variations and you need to continue? Do you add onto a current fixture record, or do you have to create a new one? How does adding that record affect other tests that use that same fixture? Those are the weird issues that you always come into. Well, I've always ran into when I've used fixtures, and I think that's why I've always gravitated towards FactoryBot.
Yeah. In those, specific kind of situations, I would probably not have a difference between a user with a bad email, user with a good email. I would use the fixer to, within the test, pull up the user with good email. Then I would just change our email to a bad one right within that test to then, test out the bad email validation or whatever. But, until it becomes a pain point, I think that, sticking with the core is the best route. But if your team and everyone else on the team is very familiar with FactoryBot, they understand adding the dependency, they don't care if they still want to use it, then that's going to be the right option.
I'm going to shoot the middle ground again. I think FactoryBot allows you to do what you're talking about there, Dave. And you're able to set up all the traits So you're not explicitly requiring, if you're data heavy and everything is supposed to be linked and every single test means that you have to have 52 associations and the magnitude of orders of creations that are happening with that, then yeah, go. Then you need that, right? But if you don't, then why are you doing it? And that's where like the trait functionality, or even, explicitly, declaring the setup without even having traits inside of your test, where you create a user and maybe it has the correct email all the time. Well, when you're creating or build stuff, whatever it is, you just pass in that fake email. Like you pass in your bad data, you pass in the things, versus like trying to maintain, a fixture or an amount of data for one test. Like that test should know as Bailey was mentioning, like the single responsibility thing, like that test only needs to know about like that data right then and there. So why does your entire fixture, why does your factory need to know about that data in that specific instance? Only the test does. So put it in the test. I guess by the way, I've only been coding for 4 months professionally. So everything I say comes from, I told my wife this. I was like, no, my mother-in-law's visiting. I told my mother-in-law, I was like, they're letting me speak, and I'm going to tell them a bunch of things from a place of, I really don't know anything, but I'm going to say it as if I know it, because it's what I currently believe. And very, very side note, what that means as a personal philosophy is we have to have strong beliefs in things, and we have to believe in something, right? But our current beliefs are like science. They should be mutable. Like it's as if we inject Immer into our life. At certain points in times, we should be able to have mutable logic, and that makes sense. But other times we should have immutable logic. And those are our opinions about what we do. So like I say things very emphatically, but I'm very willing to let Immer mutate that if need be.
So Nico, I want to say, I've been doing this shit professionally for over 10 years, like in this space of RSpec and Ruby on Rails and stuff. I have code bases.
Find shit again.
I'm sorry. I've been doing professional Ruby on Rails development and maintenance long enough that, there's some days I wake up and I'm like, you know what? I don't really want to be here, but it's my job to be here, so I'm going to be excellent at it. That's just life, right? But so from my perspective, it's easy for me to get in ruts. Like, yeah, I got this solved. There's this technique. I've been using it forever. I'm just going to keep on doing it. I actually appreciate this kind of like the teacher becomes the student kind of situations where someone like you who's coming into this with fresh eyes and you're putting philosophy and thought into it. I appreciate hearing this, and it kind of challenges some assumptions I may have made, just like Calvin challenges me and Dave challenges me and you challenge me, not to just be, well, I've been doing it this way since 2011. I've upgraded it 3 times. Damn, it works, and I'm not going to break it now because I don't really want to do that. That matters. So thank you. Was that too coarse?
Yeah.
Sorry for the coarse language. I should have been.
No, it's fine. Whiskey equals fun.
I think my biggest developer philosophy is develop for future programmer happiness. Don't do what's going to make me happy today. Do what's going to make me happy 6 months from now, when I'm having to go back and maintain what I wrote 6 months ago. And if I'm happy then the code that I wrote back then was good code.
So I like that philosophy a lot, Dave. And maybe Calvin does. I don't know. Does anyone here other than me actively maintain Ruby on Rails applications written by someone else in 2008 that are still in production?
Not that far.
So I feel like that changes your perspective a little bit about the life cycle of software, especially when it becomes enterprise IT.
Yeah. I can tell you that I always look at my code back after, there's like maybe 3 to 6 months, and I've always hate my code the way I wrote it. Just usually I'm not very happy about any code that I write for whatever reason. I think just because my styles change, or you're more informed based on what you know about something, right? So I'm always just not satisfied about that. So
Yeah. And then it becomes, well, what does it cost to rewrite this?
yeah,
And then you're like,
yeah.
well, we could do this. Oh, but now there's a data migration. Then now that's just become not only a software rewrite, but it's become an ETL process. And then it just is all downhill from there.
Yeah.
And then you realize, no, I really am stuck for the rest of my working career supporting this software.
Yeah.
Or someone is.
Someone is. Yeah.
I wrote this code with no tests, and I just left. Good luck, guys.
That, Nico, I think you're saying that in jest, and that actually happens. That actually happens. And then someone like me comes along and breaks the bad news to the business that they're about to have to spend $20,000 to $30,000 on test development before we can even start moving, because they can't afford to break functionality, and Google could shut them down any minute now because they're running on Python 2 and are out of support, way out of support. So it's like ticking time bombs on both sides. But you can't stop running the software because many thousands of users depend upon it for their daily work.
Who is doing that?
I really can't go into details. I've been as specific as I can be.
Metaphorical. Who is doing that?
Well, I'll tell you,
what
90% of companies doing it, so it's pretty easy.
Oh my god!
Point to any name any company. It's them.
That one. I'm pointing at my computer right now and my monitor.
No, we have. There's a real shortage of developers appreciating the life cycle of the code they work on. Either they don't appreciate it like intellectually, or they do appreciate it and they don't care because they're not being paid and incentivized to care. One of those two things. But the outcome is basically a wake of destruction and technical debt left in the wake of work that's being done.
I mean, I imagine like the average years a developer works at any place is probably around 3 to 4 years. I think, so I mean, there's no incentive, right? Like they'll be gone, or they'll be working on the next.
Not my problem,
thing.
not my monkeys. Yeah. And to
Yeah.
Dave's point, but it could be your problem. It could be your monkeys. If not now, you're putting it on someone else, or you're the one coming into a company, several years from now, and you're dealing with someone else's mess.
Yeah.
So just
I actually think it's actually a very it speaks a lot that I think Rails is actually it's a great platform to create production ready apps so quickly that you can that's a good testament that you see so many old ones out there, and I think most of them will run, except for the fact that they don't have an old enough Ubuntu LTS to run that version of Ruby that you need.
Well, the problem is the companies get big enough that they get security audited by the external customers, and then that's when I usually hear from them.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh yeah, you can't pass any security audits when you're this far out of support. So what does that take?
Yep. Yeah.
Well, a lot of these issues are basically the direct result of management asks, how long will it take to build this feature? 2 weeks. Well, we want it in 1 week. Can you do that? Like, well, yeah, if we cut out the tests, okay, do that.
Thank you for elevating this to the fact that, like, I know, Frank, you were like, it's about developers. You kind of brought it to like this sole responsibility. Like we all as humans should have responsibility for our actions, right? But we don't. That's why there's laws. There's always somebody like that's out there. And Dave brought up the fact that management, upper level culture is really top down. And if that culture is set up in a way that the developers feel like they don't have to care, where does that come from? Like now if they got hired that way, then where did that come from? It came from the culture of hiring. If they became that way, they became jaded, that came from the culture they were in.
There is another group of people, though, and I hear what Dave is saying, and I hear where you're going with it, but I've seen this too often. Okay? Outsource. So someone has an idea. They are not an expert in software development or any of this stuff. They have an idea. They've managed to raise a little money. Now they've come to you. Nico Roulston Incorporated as a solutions provider to help us. And maybe we should pick on someone else who's not you, because you would do your best with excellence. But what then happens is they don't know about software development. They don't know about testing. They don't know about quality control. They don't know about any of these things. And the contractor takes the point, if they don't have it in the contract, I'm not going to do it. And honestly, it's that place where you have like a trusted consultant who then proves to not be trustworthy either, because they don't actually know what they don't know. The unknown unknowns. They're a lot more green, and they do the best they can, but they didn't know to care about these things. Or I think several times, well, they're not paying me for it. It's not my responsibility to volunteer it, and do that advising on top of just being a hired hand.
So to counterpoint this, because,
okay,
I am actually on that side, right? Here's the problem is that you can't explain to management how imprecise estimating any project is, right? So the problem is that if you estimate and you are wrong and you are under, you're eating your cost. You're eating those hours. And as an individual, you can do that. The larger the company you have, you're eating profits. You're eating a lot of money. So.
Calvin, I know. The amount of money that goes out for a day's worth of meetings on a project that's not even a customer yet, I know.
Yeah. So one, the people that are looking for these projects are trying to get the lowest price they can get. So it does take a good company to know, hey, look, we're not going to go any lower than this, and this is the way it is, because you're not going to get it delivered at the time. Or you have companies that come in and low bid, knowing that, hey, look, when we're 70% done and we ask you for more money, you're going to pony up, right? And that happens a lot too. Mm-hmm. But I think going back to what Dave was saying, I don't think it's the lack of tests that makes maintenance of these applications bad, as much as there's the culture is not. There's no culture to maintain these apps once they get, once they cross that threshold.
Right. So let's look at this. We look at software. I'm sorry, I just interrupted you, Calvin. I have a point, but I'm a foot.
No, go ahead and finish.
We look at software as a capital thing. I'm just gonna make up numbers. I came up with $30,000 to pay Calvin to build me an app. Okay, that's in the realm of possibility. Calvin builds me an app. I don't plan on spending $2,000 a month forever to maintain it. And so now, 5 years from now, Calvin's moved on. He had to, right? He did other work. I didn't have work to keep him busy, and nor should I. And I can't afford to hire someone to maintain my app. Now, what happens 5 years from now? Something that I've relied upon just broke because some cloud integration happened. And now Calvin's busy. Now I'm going to go find someone else to take a look at it. But 5 years of atrophy has happened. Standards have changed. No one's familiar with the inner workings of my application. And now I get quoted $60,000 to rewrite it, at least. And I'm like, what the fuck? I thought it was just a small thing. And that's the start of that. We have to talk into the role of maintenance. So I visualize it like this. If you have like these timelines that you look at, like different like glacial periods, or like, one of these like science timelines of like Earth history, and there's like this little tiny event and there's like a long amount of time, right? I feel like in the application there's this little amount of time, which is that $30,000 I paid Calvin, and there's this long period of operations that has to be understood as part of the cost of the application in real life?
I think you're looking at like society as once again, I'm going to go to culture. That's the problem with that. Like, it's not that people aren't looking; it's that we are raised, at least in the United States, under the assumption you're getting a new house every like 4 years. I'm going to make that number up. Like, so what do you do for maintenance? What about cars? Like, we've been marketed over and over and over. Do you have a new car yet? Like, so when you ask to buy an app, what are you buying? You're buying a thing, and it's inherently, when you buy a thing, does maintenance come with it? God, yeah. I'm having my foundation checked out. I have a 210,000 mile Nissan Versa. Like, that thing runs. I spent, I don't know, maybe $500 on it in the past year to maintain it. That is far less than most people's $500 a month payment on their car, on the new one, right? So the concept of like, it's new, it's cultural, I don't need to maintain it. And as a company, like, I don't think most people take that built to last, great book, mentality of what small changes and what things do I need to do to build this thing to last. And some of that comes along with like what you were selling. Like, how much is it going to cost you to maintain this app over time? I highly recommend you do it. And it's not a sales technique, because here are the numbers. You know, if you do not, what's it going to cost you to buy a new car when it breaks out of pocket? Or if you change your oil every month, like, what is it going to cost you in that time frame? But people don't look at it like that, right? Throw it away, buy a new one.
Yeah.
Or just buy a new one before you have to throw it away.
I just want to say, you're changing your oil way too often if you're changing it once a month. Or you drive way too much.
I was going to say, or I was going to say,
I-
that's a lot of miles. I mean, we are talking Nico who rode bike across country, so maybe he's into like long road trips.
No, the bakery I had, we put it was a 2-year-old car and nearly 150,000 miles, maybe 3 years old. But it's because we lived in a remote town and drove it everywhere. But that was a different car. It was before this one.
So you actually raise a good point, and this meetup isn't primarily about cars and finance, though. We've talked about cars and finance amongst other things. Like, take the cost of that new car. Like, okay, I have, say someone wants a car with a warranty so they don't have to worry about maintenance. You can take that cost of purchase. Maybe they financed it, maybe they paid for it out of cash. And you can take the cost of that. You can take that total cost and divide it by the expected useful life of the car. Or in this case, the time after which they're convinced themselves they need a new car. You can come up with a monthly cost of the vehicle, even if you bought it, right? And then you can compare that. Whereas if you take it out much longer, that monthly cost goes down and down and down and down, because you're amortizing the cost over a longer and longer period of time. Even when you add the cost of maintenance, you are so far ahead driving that Nissan Versa in years 12 or 15, unless your ego just calls that you need a new car, then having the under warranty car, you're spending so much more, you know, with that higher refresh cycle.
So I'm going to bring a different concept into if it's a financial discussion.
Okay.
So this is the amount of dollars and how you can amortize your debt to like write it off, right? Like over time.
Yeah.
You can extend that and your amortization makes sense. But that is still total dollars that I may spend today or over time. But what is my financial benchmark for value to if I was to spend that somewhere else? So if I'm to spend
opportunity cost effectively.
Kind of, but it's also like what is the idea if I took that money and invested it? Like, what would be the amount of money that I would earn spending it, you know, in the market? It's opportunity cost, but you do a financial calculation to this benchmark to say, if I invest this money, I expect to get 7% or whatever over the next number of years returning in capital investment to myself. Right. So if you do that with an app, you're like, oop, $30,000, I expect to get 7% back. And I know at a certain amount of time later, I may have to buy a new one. Well, I'm not going to maintain it. You know, like that's a very high level cost decision. You know, and now if they're like, whoa, I had no idea. Well, then they're just not making great decisions. But I think as a business, you can make that decision not to maintain because the amount of investment that you can get, the opportunity cost, the gains you get back in other places are more beneficial.
Right. So I don't know, Nico. It seems like you could. Oh, Calvin, it is great to have you. Thanks.
Yep. Bye.
I love the freewheeling kind of discussion we got going here too. Have a good one. So I want to unpack that a little bit because you're talking about that, and maybe this is not your point, but this is what came to mind. Like, you could go out and buy, doing that same calculation, maybe you could say, I want a nice car. I just feel like I want a nice car. Those Teslas are really cool. I'm going to go for it. But then reality sets in and you're like, but a affordable $22,000 like basic but nice car and then invest the difference would be a much wiser decision, possibly. But you might buy a $5,000 MacBook, like super Apple computer like Dave does, because that's more related to your work. Or am I off base about your analysis there? The return on cash on the computer that helps you do your programming work that makes your money is better than the return on cash of the luxury purchase of the Tesla versus a capable of getting you to the places you need to go affordable car.
Similar. I don't think Dave needs an M1 MacBook Pro or an M1X or M2, whichever they've given him now, to test out. Like, I don't think he needs those things. And he can wisely spend that money on either building his own rig or as people. Ooh, so here's one. Here's one that I brought up the other day.
Sorry, Dave. I didn't mean to pick on you. You're well known as being like high-end gear person. So
I think he posted at some point. Yeah, posted about getting the latest test Mac. I had to test it.
See you, Joe.
So the concept of I lost my train of thought.
Okay, while you're regaining it, I will say that the test Mac, it was for science. Okay.
Science.
I mean, you do have Drifting Ruby. I mean, you have to have content.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I did specifically get one for that content. And I even got Apple to underwrite saying that they agreed that this is the use case that I'm going to be using it for, which is typically outside of their normal use case. So it was a weird situation, but it was for that specific purpose. So it's a tax write-off.
Yeah. Well, there's always that angle.
Here we go. It's a concept, like we talk about ease of testing and the tools that we're going to use. The concept of serverless and the idea that like everybody should move over to serverless. And yet I feel like there is going to, because it's cost efficient, the money that I'm going to spend now, et cetera, et cetera. But once like testing, once it scales, what did you bite yourself with? Your Amazon ticket goes out the roof. And when do we see as an industry businesses making that money decision to go back in-house, to bring back because of that return on investment and go like, I'm big enough, like I'm building my own servers. I think Twitter's doing it now. Dropbox did it. It saved hundreds of millions of dollars like to do this thing.
Even on the smaller scale, I will say this. My desktop computer tower that's right here that I built, and I mean, it was a nice computer, but not like crazy cutting edge in 2017. It's a gaming rig, basically, Intel i7. It runs Docker and all my tests and stuff faster than they run in the cloud. I could either pay even more for my cloud bill, or I could run it on my hardware that's already really fast that I have already invested in and it's already paid for itself several times over. So even as a developer, my own experience is this runs faster than running it in the cloud. Mm-hmm. Could I make it run faster in the cloud? Probably. But, what time does that take?
That's where you go with the hybrid approach.
Yeah.
Where your CI/CD, you run your own GitLab instance and your own home servers in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
And that will do the deployment to a proper cloud. So you get all the speed benefits with the hardware that you own while having it properly hosted.
There you go.
Or in the office if you have to have an office or something, or data center.
Yes. Though I will say sometimes having the basement at 64 degrees gets a little chilly. But it's good for the computers.
Those poor computers are sitting at like 78 degrees right now. Ambient temperature. They are not too happy.
Well, y'all, it is getting kind of late.
Yeah.
So, Nico, I wanted to give you a chance. If there's any final questions for Nico, obviously we become a freewheeling discussion group pretty easily. I really appreciate the time and thoughtfulness that you put into this presentation. I think you raised a lot of good points, and you, in my mind's eye, for me personally, learning from you, it's really great to get like that enthusiastic beginner's understanding where you're bringing ideas that are fresh to me simply because it's so easy for me to be stuck in my ways. And I appreciate the challenge that you presented there.
Yeah, I thought it was a good talk, and there was a moment there where you mentioned Anki, that you use Anki, and so the way, like, it just took me on a little thought tangent where, Anki is like automated testing for your memory, and I think it blended in well with automated testing for software projects, because ultimately it's about this continuous improvement and the growth mindset that you have, instead of just being just the and I guess it's called growth mindset versus fixed mindset, where you have a difference between conceptually, like, the innate ability in people versus the ability of people to grow intellectually, and to grow emotionally, and all those things. But the key concept for that growth being the feedback that you get from the testing. And with Anki, you're it's feedback for your memory, and with the automated testing for software, it's the feedback for improving the software. So yeah, that's
I'll put that in the next talk.
Yeah.
Why Anki makes you a better tester. Well, unless anybody had any other feedback or questions, I very much appreciate the compliments. I always learn an F ton at these meetings because I'm very new, and there are little tiny bits of gleaning insights, such you guys say, that make me better. So I'm grateful for y'all. I'm gonna start crying now.
Yeah, no, yeah, totally. Let's just have a. Thank you so much, Nico. I appreciate it, and
thanks for talking.
Absolutely
Really appreciate it.
So next month we have a talk lined up. Let me see if I can find it here. August, ATO Rug. Gentleman that popped in and visited us last month, Bohan, offered to give a talk on, I am looking at the email now, a gem for your data analysis intro in Ruby. So I'm going to reach out to Bohan, make sure he's still on board for talking next month. If not, I'll probably reach out in the Slacks for some help. But I personally would love to learn a little bit about data science in Ruby. There's so much data science that happens in Python. I think it's kind of cool to be able to do some more of it here in our favorite language. Does that sound interesting to folks?
Yeah, I just started the Bastards Book of Ruby, which does, I believe that's the goal of it, is to do a little data crunching with Ruby.
Nice. I am personally, it's not a Ruby thing. I have a book for PostgreSQL called A Curious Moon. And it's uses NASA Cassini mission data as the backdrop for the book of doing ETL in data analysis in PostgreSQL. And one trick that I already learned from the book was to use old school like Linux or make files to actually control setup, tests, and tear down of database stuff executing SQL files. I thought that's pretty badass. I love that. So lots of data analysis stuff that's fun. Anyway, be thinking if you would be interested in presenting, not you, Nikos, but anyone else would be interested in presenting in September. I guess we haven't decided September if we're in person or not. Maybe we should presume it could be online still. If anyone has a talk idea that you just really want to share, I'd love to have you present in September. Anyway, appreciate you all, and I hope you have a fabulous rest of the week and a great evening.
All right.